In the spring of 1879, a lean, bearded man of 41 stood at the rail of a steamship in San Francisco harbor, watching the city's pale fog drift across the hills, and felt, for perhaps the first time in years, that he was not quite sure what he was looking for. His name was John Muir. He had spent the better part of a decade in the Sierra Nevada of California, sleeping on granite ledges, eating crackers and tea, filling notebooks with observations about glaciers and forests and the slow machinery of the natural world. He had written about Yosemite until his words were known across the country. He had argued, publicly and passionately, that the mountains of California were sacred ground, worthy of protection, worthy of reverence. He was also, in the spring of 1879, a man who had spent too many winters indoors. There had been a courtship, a marriage, a farm in Martinez with orchards and duties and the quiet rhythm of domestic life. These things were not unwelcome, but something in him had grown restless in a way that orchards could not satisfy, and when a chance arose to join a steamer voyage northward to Alaska, a territory most Americans knew almost nothing about, he took it with a speed that suggested the decision had already been made somewhere deep in him, waiting only for the right invitation. Alaska. The word itself carried a kind of gravity. The territory had been purchased from Russia just 12 years earlier, in 1867, for a sum most newspapers called a folly. Few Americans had been there. Fewer still had gone looking for anything other than fur or gold. John Muir was going for something harder to name. He left San Francisco on the steamer Dakota in May of 1879, carrying a small bundle of clothing, several notebooks, a handful of dried bread, and a mind already trained to observe the world at a level of attention most people reserve for crises. The sea voyage north was 4 days of open water, grey and rolling, the decks mostly deserted by passengers who had retreated below to sleep off the heaving of the ship. Muir stayed on deck for most of it. He watched the gulls working the waves without any visible effort, tilting and banking through the spray as if flying were simply the natural condition of the world, which, for a gull, it is. He watched whales surface in the grey distance, their broad backs appearing and disappearing like dark boulders in a flooding river. He watched the light change across the water, the colours of the sunset piling up in layers above the horizon, deep orange, then soft rose, then a long blue darkening into night. He wrote it all down. By the time the ship reached the Straits of Juan de Fuca, threading between the green hills of Washington and the lower mountains of Vancouver Island, Muir had filled pages with observations and was beginning to understand something about why he had come. There was a quality here, of light, of scale, of density of green against grey sky, that was different from California. Not better, not worse. Simply different, larger, older, less touched. The ship put in briefly at Victoria, a small, orderly English town on the southern tip of Vancouver Island, where roses climbed the cottage walls in exuberant pink cascades, and the gardens smelled of rain. Muir walked through it and noted, characteristically, not the buildings, but the rocks beneath them, glacier-polished and grooved, bearing the unmistakable marks of a great ice sheet that had covered this entire landscape not so very long ago in geological terms. He was already reading the land like a text, looking for the story of what had shaped it. Then the smaller mail steamer California and the passage northward into the Alexander Archipelago. Nothing he had read about this stretch of coastline had prepared him for what it actually looked like. The Alexander Archipelago is not a single landscape. It is thousands of landscapes stacked and nested within one another, each turn of the channel revealing something new. The steamer moved north through what Muir described as an intricate web of land and water, a 60-mile wide embroidery of forest-clad islands and winding channels that extended for nearly 1,000 miles along the coast. The water was calm here, sheltered by the islands from the open Pacific swells. It had a quality of stillness that reminded Muir of mountain lakes, mirror flat in the mornings, barely rippled in the afternoons, catching the light in a way that made the reflections of the trees seem as solid and detailed as the trees themselves. The spruce and hemlock ran down to the waterline on every shore, their dark spire-like crowns pressed so closely together that the hillsides looked like a single unbroken surface of green. Where avalanche tracks had cleared corridors through the forest, pale alder and willow had grown up in thin strips of lighter green, and cascades tumbled down through them, visible only where they met the shore in brief, bright flashes of white water. The islands themselves came in every size. Some were large enough that their interiors disappeared into blue haze and their peaks wore permanent snow. Others were barely larger than the trees growing on them, small, round, forested islets that sat in the channel like bouquets in a vase. Their silhouettes reflected perfectly in the water below. Between them, the channels opened and closed, turned and widened, so that every few minutes a new arrangement of island and water and mountain presented itself, and Muir, leaning on the rail, found it impossible to stop watching. He wrote later that the scenery here was hopelessly beyond description. He wrote it anyway. He tried to describe the way a passage would open ahead of the ship, appearing to close as you approached and then widening suddenly at the last moment into a new chamber of island and water, the walls of forest dropping away on each side to reveal a broader channel or an open sound scattered with islets. He tried to describe the birds, the Steller's jays that flashed between the branches of the hemlocks on shore, the kingfishers that sat on drifted logs just above the waterline, the great blue herons that stood in the shallows with a stillness so absolute they seemed carved. He tried to describe the smell of salt water mixed with the resinous breath of the forest, spruce and hemlock and red cedar, a smell that has no equivalent in the inland country he had spent his life in. The nights at anchor were quiet in a way that the nights of ordinary life are rarely quiet. There were no cities nearby, no roads, no mills. The sound of the anchor chain running through the hawse-pipe would wake him, and then there would be silence, the particular silence of deep wilderness, which is not truly silent but is free of human noise, so that the creak of the ship's timber and the lap of water against the hull were the loudest things, and underneath them the calls of night birds and the occasional splash of something moving in the dark water. He slept lightly and rose early and was always on deck before the other passengers, watching the light return to the world. The ship passed through Wrangell Narrows near the end of June and pulled into the small settlement of Fort Wrangell on Wrangell Island in the southern panhandle of the territory. This was to be Muir's base of operations for the next several months. A modest place, a cluster of wooden buildings along the waterfront, a mission, a trading post, a scattering of Tlingit houses with their carved totem poles standing at the water's edge. The smell of salt water and wood smoke hung over everything. He had not been on shore an hour when he met the man who would become his companion for the summer. Samuel Hall Young, a young Presbyterian missionary newly arrived at Fort Wrangell, energetic, earnest, and possessed of an enthusiasm for wilderness that immediately impressed Muir. Young would accompany him on nearly every significant journey of the 1879 expedition. He would also, on one occasion, nearly die on a mountainside, and Muir would save his life. But that came later. In those first weeks at Wrangell, Muir did what he always did in a new place. He walked. He walked the beaches and the forests, noting the species of trees, the condition of the moss, the behavior of the birds. He talked to everyone who would talk to him, miners, missionaries, Tlingit elders, and he listened with the particular quality of attention he brought to everything, the kind that assumes the world is always saying something worth hearing. One night in September, he climbed the hill behind the town. No one quite knew why. Some accounts say he had simply wanted to see the country from a height. Whatever the reason, once he was on the hilltop, he made a fire. A large one, apparently, larger than necessary, perhaps simply because he could, perhaps because the darkness of the Alaskan night was pressing in, and a fire is, at its core, an assertion against darkness. The fire grew. It lit the sky above the town in an orange glow visible for miles. Below, on the waterfront, the Tlingit people of Wrangell looked up at the mountain and saw the blaze and were alarmed. A fire on the mountain could mean many things, none of them good. They sent word to the missionary Young, who climbed up to find Muir sitting beside his fire in complete contentment, perfectly unaware that he had frightened anyone. The Tlingit, when they heard who had made the fire and why, or why not, since there was no particular reason, had a word for what Muir was. They called him a Nakwusati, a kind of mountain spirit, a being so at home in wild places that it could only be explained by something beyond ordinary human nature. They were not entirely wrong. In late July, Muir and Young joined several others on the small steamer Glacier for an excursion up the Stickeen River, which crossed the coast range 150 miles north of Wrangell and provided the principal route to the gold mining country of British Columbia. The river was wide and fast-moving, its water turbid with glacial sediment, grey-green and cold. The canyon walls rose on either side as the ship moved inland, the mountains gaining height and presence with every mile, their forested lower slopes giving way to bare rock and snowfield high above. At Glenora, a small settlement at the head of navigable water, the Glacier tied up. The settlement was modest, a handful of buildings at the river's edge, a few boats drawn up on the gravel, a view upriver to where the mountains closed in and the world contracted to a single valley filling with shadow in the late afternoon. The air here, 50 miles or more from the coast, was drier than the air of the archipelago, carrying a different mixture of smells: dry grass and spruce resin, and something mineral from the river, cold and clean. Muir and Young decided to spend a day climbing the peak that rose above the town. This was exactly the kind of excursion that made Young both admire and privately dread his companion's company. Muir climbed as if climbing was simply how he preferred to move through the world. Quickly, lightly, without apparent concern for the steepness of the terrain or the altitude of the drop below. They went up through forest at first, then into open rock, then higher still, into the kind of country where the world falls away on all sides and the wind comes from every direction at once. The summit was close when the two men reached a chasm in the rock, a narrow slot cut deep into the face, its walls smooth and nearly vertical. Muir crossed it. Young attempted to follow. He fell. What happened next was described by both men in their separate accounts, and the accounts agree. Muir, already across, heard Young cry out and turned back to find the young missionary on the edge of an abyss, his feet hanging over nothing, his chin dug into loose shale, his hands useless above his head, his body sliding inch by inch toward the drop. Both shoulders had been dislocated in the fall. Muir moved back across the chasm. He reached Young, assessed the situation with the methodical calm he applied to everything, and proceeded to get the young man out of there by a combination of physical strength and steady, unhurried instruction. He talked Young's body into stillness. He braced his own feet against the rock. He pulled, shifted, and maneuvered until Young was clear of the edge and lying on solid ground, both shoulders still dislocated, shaking with cold and shock and the particular kind of relief that arrives only after a very close thing. Then Muir reset both of Young's shoulders on the mountainside. He did this by lying on top of him and using his knee as a fulcrum, and it worked both times. And then he helped the missionary down the mountain in the gathering dark. Later, in his journal, Muir wrote very little about his own role in the rescue. He described the mountain, the rock, the view from the summit before the accident, the way the light had fallen on the ice of a distant glacier. Young, in his own account, was rather more explicit about what had happened and who had made it possible. This was characteristic of Muir. He paid more attention to mountains than to heroism, which is perhaps what made him both easy and difficult to travel with. By October, Muir had explored the Stickeen glaciers, had written extensively about the way the ice moved and ground and sculpted the rock beneath it, had visited Tlingit villages along the coast and sat in the firelight of their longhouses listening to stories he couldn't always follow but found beautiful anyway. He was, by any reasonable measure, done for the season. The days were shortening. The mountains were already wearing fresh snow down to lower elevations than they had worn it in September. The other members of his loose party were preparing to leave. He was not ready. Word had reached him through conversations with Tlingit people along the coast of a bay to the north. A great bay, they said, with a wall of ice at its head larger than anything he had yet seen. The British charts he consulted, assembled from Captain Vancouver's surveys in the 1790s, showed no such bay, only a solid mass of glacial ice where this bay was supposed to be. This discrepancy interested him enormously. if the ice had retreated far enough to reveal an entire bay in the 80 years since Vancouver's survey, then something extraordinary was happening. Something that spoke directly to the questions about glacial action that had occupied him for a decade. He arranged a canoe. The canoe was 35 feet long, cedar, deep-hulled, capable of carrying a party of 7 with their gear. It was captained by a Tlingit chief named Toyatte, who commanded both the vessel and the 4 paddlers who made up the crew. Toyatte was, in Young's description, the grandest Indian he had ever known, a tall, calm, authoritative man who seemed to carry a natural dignity that required no performance and made no demands. Muir admired him immediately. The party that set out from Fort Wrangell in early November 1879 was small. Muir, Young, Toyatte, and 4 Tlingit paddlers. They carried camping equipment, a small store of food, and the particular kind of optimism that belongs to people setting out into unknown country in deteriorating weather. The northern coast of the Alexander Archipelago in early November is not an accommodating landscape for a small canoe. The channels are exposed to weather that moves in from the Pacific with little warning and considerable force. Rain is the default condition. Fog is frequent. The short days fill quickly with grey light and grey water and grey sky, and the mountains that rise from the shore are visible only in intervals of clarity, their summits hidden most of the time in cloud. Muir found all of this beautiful. He sat in the bow of the canoe and watched the coastline pass and wrote in his notebook with fingers that were often cold. He noted the color of the water, the way it changed from the pale green of the shallows to deep blue-black in the channel centers. He noted the way the forest came to the water's edge so closely that the canoe sometimes moved in shadow even in the middle of the day. He noted the birds, the eagles that sat in the high branches of the hemlocks, watching the water with the particular stillness of creatures that have no need to hurry, the flocks of surf scoters that moved ahead of the canoe in rolling, splashing groups, diving and surfacing, the ravens, always the ravens, their voices carrying across the water in that deep conversational call that sounds, at a distance, almost like language. At night, they pulled the canoe up on shore, made camp, built fires from the abundant driftwood. The driftwood of the Alaskan coast burns differently from inland wood. The salt in it gives the flame a tint of blue and green at its edges, something Muir noticed the first night and found beautiful and made a note of, because he made a note of everything. The food they carried was simple: dried beans, hardtack, some salt meat, tea. They supplemented it where they could, and the Tlingit paddlers knew which shores held mussels and which did not, and they gathered them in the fading light and cooked them in the coals with a casualness that spoke of 10,000 previous gatherings on 10,000 previous shores. Muir ate whatever was offered and was grateful for it, and often forgot to eat at all until Young reminded him. The Tlingit paddlers were, by now, accustomed to Muir's habits, which were unusual. He would eat, write briefly by firelight, and then disappear into the dark to walk along the beach or climb the nearest rise, returning sometimes hours later, often wet, always apparently satisfied. Young had grown used to this too, though he sometimes worried, and the Tlingit sometimes wondered aloud to Young whether their passenger was entirely in his right mind. The question was not unfair. A man who climbs mountains alone at night in November, in a territory he has never visited before, who seems genuinely delighted by weather that everyone else finds merely endurable. Such a man invites questions. But Muir was simply doing what he always did, reading the world. The night walks were not casual. He was noting the stars and the clouds and the condition of the ice on the shallows and the sound of the wind through the trees. He was building, continuously and instinctively, a comprehensive picture of this landscape in all its conditions and all its hours. He needed to see it at night as well as by day, in rain as well as in rare sunshine, from shore level as well as from the height of a ridge. Nothing less than the whole picture would satisfy him. The canoe moved north through Lynn Canal, a long straight channel running for nearly 100 miles between walls of mountain rising directly from the water. The mountains here are among the highest coastal peaks in the world, their bases in tidewater, their summits in permanent cloud. Even at sea level, the scale of them is difficult to process. They do not look like the mountains one knows from inland country. They look like walls, dark and absolute, the kind of walls that suggest there is nothing beyond them worth thinking about. The Chilkat Tlingit lived at the northern end of Lynn Canal, in villages that had existed there for generations beyond easy reckoning. Muir and Young spent several days among them, trading and talking, and Muir was particularly struck by what he observed of the social organization. The way authority was distributed, the way knowledge was transmitted, the way the people moved through their landscape with a confidence and economy of effort that spoke of long, deep familiarity. He had been told before coming to Alaska that the indigenous people of the territory were primitive. What he observed did not match this description. He saw skilled navigators, accomplished craftspeople, sophisticated traders, people with a complex and functional relationship with an environment that would have been overwhelming to most Americans of his era. He wrote about them with the same quality of careful attention he brought to glaciers and forests, as if they were worth understanding on their own terms. By the time the canoe turned southward and west again, into the labyrinth of islands and inlets that fills the upper panhandle of the territory, the weather had settled into the kind of steady, cold, grey November drizzle that is simply the condition of the Alaskan coast in late autumn. It rained most days. The mountains were invisible most of the time. The water was dark, the shorelines dark, the sky a uniform pale grey from one horizon to the other. Muir, writing in his journal by firelight each evening, used words like luminous to describe this weather. He found a quality in the grey light of the overcast that he could not find in direct sunlight, a softness, an evenness, a way that colour seemed to deepen rather than bleach under cloud. The greens of the forest were more intensely green under a grey sky, he thought. The dark water of the channels was more beautiful, not less, when there was no sun to silver it. This was not a performance of cheerfulness. It was simply how he saw things. They were paddling now toward the bay that the Tlingit had described and the British charts had failed to record. As they moved westward along the coast, the country changed. The forests thinned. The beaches became longer, strewn with boulders too large to be ordinary beach stones, glacially deposited Muir recognized immediately, dropped by moving ice in an era not so long past. The mountains began to show more bare rock and less forest. The vegetation on the lower slopes was younger, less established, the kind of growth that follows a disturbance recently enough that the disturbance is still visible in the landscape structure. The ice had been here. Not ancient ice, recent ice, within living memory, if not within the last century, and then, rounding a low headland in the last light of a short November afternoon, the bay opened before them. Muir wrote that he had not been prepared for what he saw. This is a remarkable admission from a man who had spent years in the Sierra Nevada, who had stood at the rims of the deepest valleys in California and watched the light move across granite walls thousands of feet high. He was not easily surprised by landscape. He had seen and described and understood more natural beauty than almost any person of his era. Glacier Bay surprised him. He stood in the bow of the canoe as it moved into the entrance and for several minutes said nothing. He was, ordinarily, a man who processed experience through language, who wrote while things were happening, who described as he observed. To stand in silence at the bow of a canoe and simply look was for John Muir a measure of how completely the thing exceeded his preparation for it. It was vast. The bay was perhaps 40 miles long and 10 or 15 wide, but these dimensions give no true sense of the thing because the bay was embedded in mountains so high that the scale reference was constantly overwhelming. The Fairweather Range rose from the western shore, peaks of 10, 12, 15,000 feet, carrying enormous snow loads even by Alaskan standards, their ridgelines serrated against the sky on the rare moments when the sky was clear enough to show them. On every side, glaciers descended from the mountains to the water, pushing blue ice into the bay, carving icebergs with sounds like distant cannon fire. The mountains were mantled in fresh snow down to near sea level. Young ice was forming in the protected inlets. The whole landscape was in the process of becoming winter. The color of the ice was something he had not been prepared for. Ice, in his California experience, was white. The snow on the high Sierra, the remnant glaciers in the shaded cirques. The ice of Glacier Bay was not white, it was blue, in shades that ranged from the pale, translucent blue of shallow water to a deep, saturated cobalt in the older, denser portions of the glacier's body. Where the light caught the face of the main glacier at an angle, the blue shifted toward green, and in the deep shadows of the crevasses toward a blue so dark it was nearly black. The icebergs that had carved and were floating free in the bay carried all these colors at once, turning slowly in the slight current, each facet presenting a different shade as it caught or lost the light. The canoe moved into the bay slowly. Toyatte, at the stern, read the water with the same careful attention Muir read everything else. There were hazards here, underwater ledges and shoals, currents deflected by the ice, the unpredictable behavior of calving glaciers that could send waves crashing across the bay without warning. Muir stood in the bow and looked. What he was seeing, he already understood, was the record of a retreat. This entire bay had been filled with ice not long ago, within the last century, perhaps within the last 50 years. The British charts showed solid glacier where he was now floating on open water. The Tlingit people had told him that their parents and grandparents had known this bay as ice. The land around the edges of the bay, where the glacier had recently withdrawn, was bare. Not bare like a beach is bare, with sand and ordinary stones, but bare in the way that newly exposed country is bare, as if the world has just been born and the first plants are only now beginning to discover that there is ground here at all. Moss and sedge in thin, tentative patches on the lower ground, small willows in sheltered spots, bare rock everywhere else, scoured smooth and polished by the ice that had only recently finished its work. The land was new. It had been remade. They camped the first night near the head of the bay, close to the glacier's edge. The ice wall, the face of the glacier where it met the sea, rose 300 feet above the water. In the dark, Muir could hear it, the groan and crack of ice under its own enormous pressure, and then, occasionally, the deep report of a carving event, a piece of the wall breaking free and falling into the water, followed by the sound of the wave it generated, sweeping across the bay. He sat by the fire and listened to the glacier at work. The Tlingit paddlers, camped nearby, were less enthusiastic about this particular campsite. They had been willing enough to come to the bay, willing even to push deep into it in the face of Muir's insistence, but camping this close to an active glacier face was another matter. They spoke quietly among themselves. They told Young, who told Muir, that the ice mountain was angry, that this was not a good place to sleep, that the sounds the glacier made at night were not sounds that invited easy rest. Muir acknowledged these concerns with genuine respect and made no attempt to minimize them. He simply also made no move to relocate the camp. In the morning, he climbed. There is a particular quality of light on glaciated terrain in the early morning that is unlike any other kind of light. The snow and ice, which are never truly white, they carry tones of blue and green and sometimes a deep violet in the shadows. Catch the first horizontal light of dawn and seem to generate their own luminosity, as if the ice is doing something more than simply reflecting what falls on it. Muir had spent years understanding why this happens and could explain it in precise geological and optical terms. He sometimes did in his writing. He also sometimes set all of that aside in favor of simply saying, "It was beautiful beyond what words can hold." He moved over the glaciated terrain as he always moved in mountains, quickly, confidently, in a way that occasionally alarmed the people watching him from below. He was following the structure of the ice, reading it as he went, the pattern of crevasses, the direction of flow lines, the color variations that indicated depth and pressure and age. Each feature was a sentence in the long narrative the glacier was telling about itself. What he was finding confirmed and expanded the theory he had spent years developing, that the landscapes of the American West, including the peaks and valleys of the Sierra Nevada he knew so well, had been shaped primarily by the action of ancient glaciers. This was not, in 1879, a universally accepted view. There were prominent geologists who believed the valleys of California had been formed by catastrophic events, floods, subsidence, the collapse of mountain caverns. Muir had argued for decades that the evidence pointed instead to the slow, patient, enormous work of ice moving downhill under its own weight. Here in Alaska, he had found the living proof. The glaciers of Glacier Bay were not ancient. They were present tense, working right now, and they were working in exactly the way he had theorized the ancient glaciers must have worked. The polished rock surfaces, the sculpted valley walls, the moraines and erratics, and the strange bare new land at the glacier's retreating edge. All of it matched the pattern he had seen in the Sierra Nevada, preserved in rock long after the ice itself had vanished. He was not, in this moment, triumphant. He was something quieter and more satisfying than triumphant. He was confirmed, which is a different feeling. It is the feeling of a long conversation finally arriving at its natural conclusion. He wrote for hours at the glacier's edge, sitting on polished rock, his back against a large erratic boulder, his notebook on his knee, filling pages with observations and measurements and descriptions that would eventually find their way into published articles and, after his death, into the book called Travels in Alaska. He described the moraines, the long ridges of rubble that the glacier had pushed ahead of itself and left behind when it retreated, running parallel to the direction of flow, marking the stages of the ice's withdrawal like rings in a tree trunk mark years of growth. He described the erratics, boulders that the glacier had picked up somewhere in the mountains and carried, sometimes for miles, before depositing them in places where the local geology made no sense of them, foreigners in the landscape, witnesses to a longer and stranger journey than they could tell. He described the polished rock surfaces, where the glacier had ground the stone smooth over centuries of passage, leaving behind surfaces that caught the light like dark mirrors and sometimes showed, faintly, the scratches and striations left by the passage of the ice, a kind of geological handwriting if you knew how to read it. He was reading it. He had spent years learning how. Below him, in the bay, the canoe sat small and dark against the immensity of the water and the ice. The icebergs moved with the slight current, drifting with a slowness that made them seem stationary until you looked away and looked back and found them somewhere new. The glacier groaned. Somewhere high above, a tern called Muir kept writing. That second night in Glacier Bay, they built a larger fire. The driftwood on the beaches near the glacier was abundant, brought in by the tides and stranded on the new, bare land at the bay's head, evidence of forests that had existed long before the last advance of the ice had buried them. Some of this wood had been underground for centuries, compressed under the weight of hundreds of feet of ice, and now it was on the surface again, exposed by the glacier's retreat, and it burned with a particular intensity that Muir noted in his journal. Around the fire, Toyatte and the other Tlingit men told stories. Muir could follow almost none of them directly. The language barrier was absolute, except where Young could translate, and Young's translations were partial, interpretive, the meaning passing through the filter of a young missionary's understanding of a culture he had been part of for only a few months. But Muir listened anyway, the way he listened to everything, finding in the rhythm and cadence of the stories something worth attending to even when the specific content was obscure. He learned, through Young's translations, that the Tlingit people had a history with this bay that went back far beyond the period of the current glacier's advance. They remembered, in stories passed down through generations, a time when the bay had been open water, before the glacier had come down and filled it, displacing the people who had lived along its shores. The glacier's advance and the disruption it had caused was a living memory for some of the older people, transmitted to the younger generation not as history, but as something closer to family experience. Muir found this extraordinary. What geologists could only read in the rock record, the advance and retreat of glaciers over decades and centuries, was preserved here in human memory, in stories told around fires, in the living knowledge of a people who had watched the ice move and had moved with it. He sat with this thought for a long time, watching the fire, listening to the sounds of the bay. The bay at night was not silent. There was the glacier, always, its groaning and cracking, the occasional deep report of a calving event, followed by the rolling wash of the wave it made, spreading in dark circles across the dark water. There were the icebergs, clicking against each other where they had gathered in the calmer water of a nearby inlet, a sound like very large glasses of ice water being gently jostled. There were birds he couldn't see, something calling from the far shore with a cry that carried across the water and arrived diminished and strange, as if the distance had changed it into something else. There was the fire, and the wind across the fire, and the sound of the wood shifting as it burned. Muir listened to all of it. He had always been, underneath the scientific apparatus of his observation, a man who simply loved to be present in wild places at night. Not for the things he could learn from them, though he learned from them constantly, but for the quality of the presence itself. There was something that happened to the mind in true wilderness after dark that didn't happen in any other condition. It quieted. The ordinary stream of planning and remembering and anticipating that constituted daily consciousness slowed, thinned, became less insistent. What remained was simpler. The fire, the sound of the ice, the cold air, the dark water. It was, he thought, close to what sleep feels like from the inside. That transition between the busy world of waking thought and the deeper, quieter country that lies just beyond it. They spent 4 days in Glacier Bay, moving the canoe deeper into the bay on the second and third days, exploring the subsidiary inlets where smaller tributary glaciers met the water, watching the calving and listening to the ice. Muir climbed every day different ridges and headlands that gave him different views of the bay's geography, different perspectives on the pattern of ice and rock and new land. On the 4th day, the weather shifted. A wind came out of the northwest, cold and direct, carrying the first real suggestion of winter in its texture. The sky turned from grey to a harder, darker color, and the mountains to the west disappeared entirely behind fast-moving cloud. Toyatte read the weather with the unhurried certainty of a man who had spent his life on this water and said, through young, that it was time to go. Muir agreed. He had what he had come for, not in the sense that he had satisfied his curiosity, which he suspected could never be fully satisfied, but in the sense that he had gathered what this visit could give and understood that the rest would have to wait for another journey. The canoe moved south out of the bay in the last morning light, the icebergs parting before the bow, the glaciers groaning, fading slowly as the distance grew. Behind them, the ice wall caught the pale light and glowed in shades of blue that Muir found himself turning to look at again and again as they paddled, the way one turns to look at a painting that is finally, definitively out of reach. The paddle back to Fort Wrangel took the better part of 2 weeks. The weather closed in and stayed closed. Low cloud, frequent rain, occasional squalls that required immediate effort with the paddles to keep the canoe's bow pointed into the waves. They stopped most nights on whatever shore was nearest, building fires in the rain with the particular efficiency of people who have done it many times, eating quickly, sleeping in whatever shelter the terrain offered. Muir was content. He was on his way home, to the temporary home of Fort Wrangel, and then, eventually, to Martinez and the orchards and the life he had built there. But he was content in a way that had something to do with having been fully present for something extraordinary, something that would stay with him in the particular way that only certain experiences stay, not as a memory one revisits so much as a change in how one sees everything afterward. He had found in Glacier Bay a living laboratory for every theory he had spent years developing. He had watched ice at work in real time, the grinding, groaning, calving, retreating process that had shaped the landscapes he loved, made visible in a way that no amount of reading in California could have provided. He had seen the new land that emerges when the ice retreats, bare and tentative and full of possibility. He had camped beside a glacier face and listened to it breathe. And he had stood more than once on high ground above the bay and looked out at a landscape so vast and so untouched and so obviously indifferent to human presence that it had worked in him the particular effect that only truly wild places can work: a deep, physical quieting of the ordinary noise of the mind, a slowing of thought, a sense of being correctly sized. He arrived back at Fort Wrangel in mid-November 1879, thin and tired and satisfied. The town looked different to him on his return, smaller somehow and more human-scaled than it had looked in July when he'd arrived with fresh eyes. The totem poles of the Tlingit houses were familiar now. The smell of the mission kitchen was familiar. The faces of the people who had stayed through the season were familiar. He had been away long enough that returning felt like arriving somewhere he could, in a limited way, call home. Young was waiting for him at the dock. The young missionary looked at Muir, the lean, weathered, barely rested figure climbing out of the canoe, and felt the mixture of admiration and mild concern that Muir seemed to reliably inspire in people who cared about him. He had been gone 6 weeks in a small, open canoe in Alaskan autumn, camping in rain and wind and cold, sleeping on shores that no other non-Native American had likely slept on before. He had come back with dozens of pages of notes and a light in his eyes that Young associated by now with whatever happened to Muir when he was in country he found extraordinary. They went inside and ate, and Muir talked for hours about the glaciers, about the bay, about the new land at the ice's retreating edge, about the Tlingit stories of ice advancing and retreating, about the color of the icebergs at different times of day. Young listened and ate and watched his companion's hands move when he described the structure of a crevasse, drawing the geometry in the air in front of him, as if he were still out there on the ice and needed only to point. Later, after Young had gone to bed, Muir stayed up by the lamp and wrote. The winter at Fort Wrangel passed slowly, with short days and long evenings, and the particular darkness of high-latitude winter pressing against the windows of the missionary's house where Muir stayed. He wrote letters home to his wife, long letters full of the landscapes he had seen and the ideas they had generated, trying to give her some sense of the scale and quality of what he had encountered. He wrote up his observations on the glaciers. He worked through the evidence he had gathered, fitting it into the larger argument he had been making for years about the glacial origins of American mountain landscape. The Glacier Bay observations were, he was certain, among the most valuable he had ever made, not simply because they were dramatic, which they were, but because they were precise. He had seen the mechanism at work. He also thought, in the quieter hours, about what it meant that a bay 40 miles long had been filled with ice within living human memory, and was now open water, and that new land was appearing at the glacier's retreating edge every year. Something in what he had seen in Glacier Bay stirred in him an unease that was different from the ordinary anxieties of a working naturalist, a sense that the world was in the middle of a change that was not simply the ordinary change of geological time. He would return to Alaska. He was already certain of that. The following summer, 1880, he was back to Glacier Bay, deeper this time, further north, camping on the glacier itself in a tent during a storm while icebergs carved around him in the dark. He would go back in 1890 and again in 1899, each time finding the glacier further retreated, the bay longer and more open, the new land at its head more established with vegetation. The glacier that bears his name, Muir Glacier, the largest tidewater glacier in Glacier Bay, had, by the time he saw it in 1880, already begun the retreat that would continue through the 20th century and into the 21st. In his lifetime, he watched hundreds of feet of it disappear. He documented the retreat with the same methodical care he brought to everything. In the summer of 1880, Muir returned to Glacier Bay. He arrived in August this time, when the days were long and the mountains showed themselves more readily, the clouds lifting for hours at a stretch to reveal peaks and ridges that had been invisible on the November visit. The bay had changed. Even in the 8 months since he had last seen it, the glacier had retreated further, measurably, visibly, in a way that startled him even though he had expected it. The bare new land at the glacier's head was larger. The bay was longer. The ice wall had pulled back. He set up camp on the moraine, the long ridge of glacial debris that the Muir Glacier had deposited at its edge, and from there he could watch the calving directly, the slow, constant process by which the glacier shed its face into the sea. He watched it for hours. Great slabs of blue ice would crack loose from the wall with a sound like a rifle shot and fall into the water in slow motion, a fall that seemed slower than it could possibly be. The way large things falling always seem to take longer than physics suggests. When they hit the water, the sound was enormous, and the wave they generated would roll across the bay and rock the canoe where it was tied to a stone at the moraine's edge. He slept in a tent on the moraine, within sound of the glacier, and woke each morning to the light falling on the ice in colours that were different every day. The angle and quality of the summer light giving the glacier a different character in morning mist, in clear midday sun, in the long amber glow of the northern evening. He made sketches, which he was not especially skilled at, but attempted anyway, trying to capture something of the colour and structure that his words, he felt, were always reaching for, but never quite holding. He also, on one extraordinary day of the 1880 expedition, tied himself to a rope and walked out onto the glacier itself in the middle of a storm. The storm came on quickly, as Alaskan weather does, and was severe. Wind-driven rain mixed with sleet, visibility down to a few yards, the surface of the glacier treacherous with new ice over the old. Anyone with ordinary good judgment would have returned to camp. Muir went further onto the ice. He wrote later that he had needed to see what the glacier looked like in storm conditions, that the storm was simply another aspect of the glacier's life that he would be incomplete without experiencing. This was true, and it was also perhaps not quite the whole truth. There was in Muir a quality that went beyond scientific curiosity, a genuine desire to be fully present in whatever conditions the wilderness offered, an unwillingness to observe nature only in its comfortable versions. The glacier in November calm was one thing. The glacier in August storm was another. He wanted both. He came back to camp hours later, soaked through, chilled, and in the company of the small, rough-coated dog who had followed him out onto the ice and had, on this day, demonstrated a quality of courage and attachment that Muir would spend the rest of his life trying to do justice to in writing. In 1880, on his second Alaska expedition, Muir took with him a small, rough-coated dog belonging to a family in Fort Wrangell. The dog's name was Stickeen, after the river where Muir had made the first of his Alaskan expeditions. Stickeen accompanied him on a day journey across a glacier in a storm that became genuinely dangerous. The kind of day when one looks back at it afterward and wonders what possessed one, and then knows exactly what possessed one. The same thing that always had. The story of Stickeen and the glacier became one of Muir's best-known works, a long essay that gave readers who had never seen a glacier some sense of what it felt like to move across one in difficult conditions, with only a small dog for company and no clear certainty that one would find the way off before dark. It was, characteristically, not primarily a story about Muir. It was a story about the dog. This is perhaps the best summary of John Muir that can be offered. A man who spent his life attending so completely to the world around him that he often forgot to attend to himself, who found in glaciers and forests and the bare new land at the edge of retreating ice a quality of significance that he never entirely managed to put into words but never stopped trying, who went to Alaska in the autumn of his working life as much to find proof of a theory as to find himself in a landscape large enough to make him feel, for a while, correctly sized. He succeeded at the theory. He exceeded the landscape in a way that is harder to quantify. In the last days of November 1879, before the ship South arrived to take him away from Alaska for that first winter, Muir walked out to the end of the dock at Fort Wrangell in the early evening. The light was going. The mountains across the channel were dark shapes against a sky that had held its last pale color for perhaps 20 minutes and was now letting it go. The water was still and cold and very dark. Somewhere far to the north, the glaciers of Glacier Bay were groaning in the dark, carving icebergs into water that no ship would visit for months. He stood there for a long time, the way he always stood in places he was about to leave, long enough to look and look again, to let the looking settle into something that would last. Then he went inside and opened his notebook and wrote. The handwriting in the journals from this period, still held in archives at the University of the Pacific, still legible in their careful, dense script, has a particular quality in these late entries. The observations are still precise, still methodical, still filled with the specific detail that made Muir's field notes among the most valuable scientific documents of his era. But there is something else in them too, a quality of tenderness toward what he was describing, as if he understood that these landscapes, the icebergs, the Tlingit villages, the bare new land at the glacier's edge, the ravens over the channels at dusk, were not simply subjects for study, but companions of a kind, and that leaving them, even temporarily, was a departure worth marking with care. He marked it with care. What he wrote in those last pages of the 1879 journal was not a summary or a conclusion. It was more like an extension of the observation he had been making for months, a continuation of the looking. He described the water and the light and the mountains and the sound of the channel at dusk, and he described the feeling of being about to leave a place he would carry with him, and he described, with some difficulty, the sense he had that the landscape of Alaska was doing something to him that landscapes had always done, but that Alaska was doing more fully and more permanently than anywhere he had been before. He was not, he wrote, certain he could explain what this was. He knew it was not simple beauty, though beauty was certainly part of it. He knew it was not simply the scientific value of what he had found, though that value was real and large. It was something about the scale of the place, the way it refused to fit inside any human frame of reference, the way it existed on terms entirely its own, indifferent to whether it was observed or admired or understood, complete and sufficient and utterly itself, regardless of what any visiting naturalist thought about it. This, he wrote, was what he had always been looking for. Not the specific glaciers or the specific bay or the specific Tlingit stories of ice advancing and retreating, but this quality of fairness, of landscape that simply is, without apology, without audience, without any need for human witness to justify its existence. He had found it before, in moments, in the Sierra Nevada, but here, in Alaska, it was not a moment. It was everything, as far as the eye could see, in every direction. Then he closed the notebook, packed his small bundle of clothing and books and specimens, and waited for the ship south. He would be back, and after that he would be back again, and the glacier that bore his name would still be there, still retreating, still carving icebergs into the dark water of the bay, still groaning in the night with the sound that the Tlingit had described as anger and that Muir understood as simply the sound of the world working, the slow, enormous, patient work of ice and rock and time, making and remaking the land in ways that no human lifetime is long enough to fully witness, but that a human life spent paying attention can at least, in part, begin to understand. Thanks for watching. Sleep well and good night.